Into the Labyrinth, Chapter 2, Myth and History. I honestly couldn't tell you the first time I encountered the story of the Labyrinth in a book or a movie, though it seems like its imagery and characters have been with me most of my life. I knew from the time I was young that my mother's teenage dream had been to be an archaeologist and excavate ruins in Crete. I don't know if she developed this fantasy before or after she read The Bull from the Sea and The King Must Die by Mary Renault. My mother double majored in archaeology and anthropology at the University of Maryland in the 1970s, but ended up dropping out after a couple of years and attending nursing school instead. Even so, she never gave up her fascination with the past. While I was growing up, our living room was full of old-school archaeological volumes on world mythology, Paleolithic cave paintings, priestesses and shamans and their journeys through altered states of consciousness. We didn't have internet or cable, so I would sit on the floor for hours, reading books about ancient civilizations. Sometime when I was a young adult, my mother gave me copies of the Mary Renault novels retelling Theseus's saga, but I couldn't get past the first 15 pages or so before thinking, nothing good is going to happen to anyone in this story. I just couldn't get very far into those books. But I must have absorbed the story of the Labyrinth somehow or some way that I can't remember, because by the time I was a teenager, I fell in love with James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, and I recognized the reference behind the protagonist's name, Stephen Dedalus, and was familiar with the origin myth. And like the young Irishman in the story, who feels physically and mentally confined by his provincial life, like Stephen Dedalus, I also wanted to fly as far away from home as soon as possible. Now, a lot of people have encountered some version of the Labyrinth story somewhere, especially the part about Daedalus and Icarus. There has been a profusion of artwork, poetry, and various retellings of the tale, which continue to this day. If we go in the other direction, however, and try to look for the historical origins of the story, there's only so much that can be realistically done. I think the line between what is called history and what gets labeled as myth can get blurry and even impossible to draw in a lot of cases, where there's few records or artifacts left, and not much anyone can do except speculated. A lot of people have speculated, starting with the origin of the image itself, the winding tunnels, convoluted serpentine paths, and the resulting structure of the labyrinth. Even before there were stories or written history, there's archaeological evidence suggesting that people have been worshipping in caves probably as long as there have been people. One theory is that the origin of the labyrinth arises from humans' earliest memories of going inside a cave, deeper through the caverns and tunnels, and the spiritual experiences that occur during the journey into the womb of the earth. These images and memories predate written language, if not oral storytelling. In this particular story, though, related to the island of Crete, archaeologists have identified some places they think inspired it. Between 1877 and 1900, Arthur Evans and a team of archaeologists in Crete found huge ruins that they called palaces. Although there's no evidence that royal families or anyone actually lived in them. Most evidence now suggests that these complex structures were used for religious ceremonies. The construction of the first palace they found, which is called Knossos, began around 1900 BCE and continued for 5 centuries until the palace was destroyed around 1350 BCE. My mother really wanted to go there, but never had a chance in her lifetime. I went in 2023 and saw the huge complex of ruins for myself. There's hardly words to describe it. The ruins, but when the structure itself was standing, it had about 1,400 individual small rooms connected to each other. And there's nothing anyone can do but guess what they were used for. Now, the British archaeologist Arthur Evans named the civilization that constructed this palace and others that they found from around the Bronze Age in Crete. They called this the Minoan civilization because he was reminded of King Minos in the story of the Labyrinth. We don't know the name these people actually called themselves. Further archaeological research since that time gives us more light into this civilization. To give an idea how far back this goes, the first settlements started around the time of 3100 BCE. So that's coming out of the Stone Age into the Neolithic, 3,000 years before the Common Era. The time of their decline was around 1450 BC. So that's about more than 1,500 years that they existed. It's the oldest civilization in the world after ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt. And it's the oldest civilization in Europe. No one has deciphered their written language, so we don't know the stories they told about and among themselves. By the time that some of the characters from the Labyrinth story appear in the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, which are thought to be recorded around 800 BCE, that's still hundreds of years after the civilization on Crete fell. So much about the Minoans has been lost to history, but one thing is obvious. If you go to the ruins of Knossos or to the neighboring archaeological museum in Heraklion, or even if you look at this online, you can see the bull was a very prominent symbol in their culture. I don't want to say they worship bulls, because that could be an oversimplification, but the iconography is everywhere. Another common symbol they used was the double-headed axe, which is called a labrys. That's actually where the name Labyrinth comes from. It means place of the labrys. Now, if you look at the artifacts in the museum, the axes are all different sizes. There are some taller than a person, and then there are some that are small talismans to be worn directly on the body. Apparently, in all of the art that they're depicted, only women hold them. And given the way that they're constructed, they're really impossible to use in combat. So the common interpretation is that these were ceremonial objects that might have also been used for religious sacrifices. Many have commented that the image of the double-headed axe, the labrys, resembles a butterfly, an ancient symbol of death and rebirth. It's also thought the word labrys is connected to the word that would later become labia, and the image is also reminiscent of a female labia. Combining the vulvic imagery and the practice of cave worship, it doesn't take much to imagine all the literal and metaphorical associations of entering a portal into a long tunnel, traveling to the center, perhaps even dying along the way and meeting the divine. This group of images and themes, or some version of them, probably led up to the most well-known surviving story we have now. The version in Ovid's Metamorphosis is from a Roman poet writing around 8 years after the birth of Christ. So that's still more than 1,000 years after the civilization collapsed. But one thing that has been historically documented is that the Minoan civilization in Crete was invaded by the Mycenaeans, a people who came from the mainland peninsula, including Athens, around 1450 BCE. Around the time of this invasion was also the declining age of the palaces, when the Minoan civilization had passed its golden age. The palace at Knossos itself was destroyed about 100 years later, likely in a fire. There's another reason that the Minoan civilization has drawn a lot of attention, particularly in the last several decades. In the surviving art and artifacts, there are no signs of warfare. There's also been a lot of speculation that women played a prominent role in this culture because of the way they're depicted in artwork. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that it was a matriarchal culture, or an inverse of patriarchy, insofar as women were the rulers or held all the power. It could have perhaps been matrilineal, and power was passed down through women, or matrifocal, and that women could have been a major focus in government, commerce, and religious ceremony, not just confined to a domestic sphere with very few rights, which is a lot of what happened in later ages. This is at least what the evidence anyone has at this point suggests. I use the word suggest because that's all anyone can do when it comes to the ancient past. There's a popular accusation that this theory, the idea of a pre-patriarchal society that didn't participate in war, where women held important roles, and that there was cooperative work and perhaps even equality among genders, is just another myth, created recently by feminists who want to romanticize the past in accordance with their own desires. Well, to that, I can only respond, well, that could be true. Certainly the part about feminists, or anyone else for that matter, wanting to romanticize or rewrite the past. After all, it seems the Mycenaeans could have easily done that when they conquered the Minoans, or any conquering civilization rewriting history in their favor. The part about whether this particular fantasy about the Minoans is accurate, or at least more accurate than any of the others, I can't say. I can't speak with any certainty about what happened 1,500 years before the Common Era. I do have to admit that I had the same criticism when I first encountered this theory, that there was some ideal society governed by women that never went to war. That this must be a fantasy, saying more about current supporters than it does about actual history. The more I thought about it, though, I thought, well, probably most of what we call history, and certainly most of what I was taught in school, we may as well call fantasy, or at the very least a mythology. And when I use the word mythology here, I'm using it loosely, adopting my mentor Craig Chalquist's definition of myth as a guiding story. However, these guiding stories often come with claims of literal history, and selectively interpret varying amounts of concrete evidence from the past in order to rationalize the ideologies of the present. This seems to me like another definition of myth that comes from Roland Barthes, who said myth is history made into nature. In other words, we, or some group in power, created a story to make it look like things could never have been any other way than the way they are now. I'm not saying that we should disregard evidence when we have it, or abandon all reason and decide whether something is true or not based on how we feel alone, especially when it comes to more recent events. But when it comes to ancient history, when there is so little physical evidence, and it's just impossible to ever know, maybe we should be looking at the value of these interpretations, less in terms of how accurate they are factually, which is always going to be questionable and incomplete, and look more closely on the impact they have on our current social conditions. What are the political and psychological consequences that become with believing one account over another? Whether it comes to these stories from Crete or anything else. And if we were to look at it that way, does believing the myth that there once existed peaceful goddess-worshipping cultures do any more harm than other myths, including certain ones Americans like to believe or believed in the past, such as the story of the first Thanksgiving? So that's just a long way of saying, I don't know what really happened, in Crete or anywhere else, or what story is quote-unquote true. Although I do think all stories make a difference to the people who believe in them or endorse their ideology. By that, I mean you don't have to believe in it literally, that Minos was a real king, or living person or historical figure, or that this monster, the Minotaur, actually existed and was put inside a labyrinthine structure. But if you believe the lessons that you're taking from the story and are uncritically absorbing the view of the world it presents, then it's probably affecting your thinking in ways you're not even consciously aware of. As the saying goes, history is written by the conquerors. In the most well-known version of the Labyrinth story, there is a central political conflict between Athens and Crete, represented in the characters of the young prince Theseus and the tyrannical king Minos. Yet the iconography and artifacts from ancient Crete suggest a civilization where the bull and the labyrinth were revered. However, the story most people know depicts these things as negative. A malicious, arrogant king becomes overly attached to a bull, and his cursed wife even more so. The sacred space of the labyrinth, likely inspired by the serpentine spiral journey of worship in caves, is transformed into a structure that traps and confines a monster. And the depiction of that monster is a perversion of something that we know this culture held sacred. Stories change over time, and not without motivation, political or otherwise. Everything depends on the perspective of the tellers. Christine Downing, a prolific post-Jungian author and adept psychologist, wrote an essay called Ariadne, Mistress of the Labyrinth. She notes that in the popular versions of the Labyrinth story, King Minos's daughter, Ariadne, is a human princess, defined by her relationship to men. The daughter of the king, the love interest who accompanies the hero, and then the tragic abandoned lover. Downing claims it more likely that in the past, Ariadne was a goddess, and perhaps the prominent goddess of Crete, the mistress of the labyrinth herself, worshipped in caves and in the palace structures inspired by them. Downing says, in the Homeric world, there are female figures, not just Ariadne, but also Helen of Troy, for instance, who were clearly once goddesses, now divested of their overwhelming magic by being made human. Over and over again, even in Homer, we find clues that these women once had much more power, scope, and significance than they do on the surface and the accepted versions. So, according to this theory, Ariadne's role was later demoted, and she becomes not only a human, but essentially a pawn to the greater game that is being played around her in other people's power struggles. Downing, though, does make a point to talk at length in her essay about Ariadne and her rescue and marriage to the god Dionysus, that the whole reason that she was abandoned by Theseus on the island is because she wasn't meant for a human lover, or to be a human husband, or to be a wife. She was meant for the god. Now, when I look at my own relationship to this story, and other classical Greek and Roman stories as well, I think how often I've been drawn to the masculine characters more than the feminine ones. It seemed to me like in a lot of these old stories, most of the women were passive and boring, or if they were powerful and human, they were usually evil in some way. And most of them were doomed, especially if they were mortal. On the other hand, when I think of Christine Downing's work, it's mind-opening to know that there were other possible stories, and perhaps older stories that had women in different roles, even if we don't know what these stories are today. I'm aware that the narrative I know best, and that has shaped a lot of my psychic and emotional maturation, is patriarchal. And by that, I mean the Roman version and the Mycenaean version that came before that. This story, as a lot of other stories, is part of the inheritance that I struggle with. I have respect for the tradition and how it shaped me, and it's precisely because I love it so much and it's been so influential on me is the reason that I need to be critical of it. Coming back to the idea of a myth as a guiding story, and that includes any kind of narrative or ideology or something that has a greater role in your life. Those are the things I think that we need to examine the most, because it's dangerous to become trapped in one narrative, one set of symbols, and one possible interpretation to the point where you can't imagine anything else. When I look at the bulk of stories that I've received in, the broad West European and Western tradition, you would think there is no other way but war and tyranny, heroes and monsters, lust and tragedy. I could go on. And there's no other system but new kings coming in to kill the old ones and repeat the cycle. But when you look at the artifacts that come from Bronze Age Crete, there's other images and symbols that open up doors to other worlds and way of thinking. I think of the symbols of death and rebirth, the double-headed axe, the butterfly, and also the snake. And among those, the last of these has particularly been portrayed as malevolent. Yet all of them hint at death and rebirth and renewal. I don't know what the stories were of these ancient cultures, nor do I want to romanticize the past. I don't know if I would have had a good time living in Minoan Crete. And I don't necessarily want to create a speculative story about it either. My project has been to examine the story as I know it, while realizing there are so many unknowns, so many different layers of stories and meanings that might be lost forever. And I think that's my fascination with it, and my mother's fascination with the past too, these mysteries that can never be solved. And when I come to the core parts of this story, the story of the Labyrinth and Daedalus and Icarus, and I think a story like this, or any myth that's endured for a long time, even if it changes for political reasons or entertainment or just over the course of time, the story itself is a living thing that is endured because people have kept it alive, and something about it still speaks to people. I don't want to fall into the trap of thinking a myth or a story or a narrative can ever be removed from history, that there's some timeless universal realm free of all that. Just a world of hollow archetypes, or if there is such a world, it has no meaning for us humans. It's a complete abstraction. Every story that we know that has been told and retold by people, by humans, has some socio-political context. If not explicitly, then the way it implicitly reflects the values of the teller or the purpose someone has in telling it, and for everyone who believes in its core messages. When it comes to the story of the Labyrinth that I told in Chapter 1, however it came to us, I acknowledge that it has its own cosmos, its own world of interrelated symbols and relationships, and its own internal logic. Whether or not this story or any ancient story is true, I don't know. I don't particularly care. I think it's impossible to know. I also think it's impossible for anyone or any group of people not to project their own ideologies onto the past and make it what they want for their own purposes. The more interesting question for me is, how can we become more aware of our own biases and the effect they have on us? So as I continue into different meandering and spiraling reflections of this original core story that I told in the last chapter, I have to acknowledge that this story is only one of many possibilities, either when it comes to originals or stories that could exist with these same characters. I'm going to try to take everything, and I encourage my listeners to take me too, with a grain of salt and a critical ear. Just because this is what we've inherited doesn't mean it never could have been any other way. And likewise, my insights and interpretations of this story are not meant to be the only ones. And I hope that this story is able to inspire something in you as well.